This episode, I'm joined once again by Bryan Counter to discuss the literature of Maurice Blanchot. I'd like to say a big thank you to all paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, as Hermitix runs off patronage and donations alone, then please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Bryan Counter, thanks once again for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me back again.
So after our last discussion on Gilles Deleuze's Proust and Signs, we were emailing back and forth, and we decided to record an episode on specifically on the literature of Maurice Blanchot. And we're doing this in part because we both want to talk about Blanchot's writing and literature, but also because, Bryan, as I understand it, there is to be a periodical which people can sign up to receive for free from the publisher, which I've now sort of done a lot of work with in reviewing their books and talking to Sam Kunkel, First to Knock. So yeah, just tell us a little bit about this periodical.
Yeah, so I've been in touch with Michael Daly, who runs the press, and corresponded with him a bit. And I think what happened is I sent him a PDF of some Blanchot, and he contacted me and asked if I would be interested in sort of curating or editing this periodical. So it's not, it's just, I think it'll be 3 essays. I'm writing something, actually, it'll be maybe a strange essay about Algernon Blackwood and Blanchot. So it's more speculative, I guess, but I found some parallels there. And then the other 2 essays will be by Jeff Fort, who I think teaches at UC Davis in California, and then John McKean, who I believe is at Reading. McKean has translated the Blanchot biography by Bidon, and Jeff Fort has written a lot on Blanchot, but has an excellent book called The Imperative to Write, which is on Kafka, Beckett, and Blanchot. So that will be coming out, I think, in August. So anybody who's listening who wants a copy, go to the First to Knock website, and there will be instructions for getting a copy. It's totally free, no digital at all. It's just print, and you'll get it in the mail for free if you email Michael by, I think the deadline is mid-June, so say June 16th is the deadline for that.
Okay. Well, I'll be sure to put those links in the description below, but that's, I guess, to dive in with Blanchot, we both sort of agreed that a very short, I think it's about 4 pages, at least in the Station Hill Blanchot Reader, this essay is very short, but very key. The Gaze of Orpheus, which is related to the myth of Orpheus descending to the underworld in a pact to retrieve his Eurydice, and yes. the pact, or in a way, I guess, sort of a curse, sort of a strange paradox. At least it's read this way, is that he's holding her arm, her hand, and he has to have a sort of strange faith in the pact and in something else, because he's not allowed to look back to make sure she's with him. Otherwise, I believe she will be cast back. And I believe in the classical version, he does look back and all goes to pot.
Yes.
But what is Blanchot's reading and understanding of this?
Right. So we were just discussing how Blanchot, and as Kevin Hart said in his episode, Blanchot has a couple of big ideas that he keeps sort of recasting. And even if you look at his more straightforwardly critical writing about different authors, and we should maybe discuss this as well, but whoever he's writing about is almost a partner in him being able to articulate something about literature, right? And I think that Orpheus, the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, is for Blanchot, in a way, the impetus of literature. For him, it describes not only the task, I guess, of the writer, like the impossible, and also paradox is like the key principle of Blanchot's method, right? So it is this paradox that is crucial to what it is to write literature, but I think also maybe what it is to read literature, or what at least what the stakes are in literature. It's not simply there is something akin to romanticism where there's this life or death engagement with art, but it's not simply passion understood in a straightforward way. It's actually this passion or this, this love or lust or whatever's happening between Orpheus and Eurydice, where what happens, he can't hear her anymore. So he looks back and then, she's condemned to the underworld and then he's ripped apart basically. So they both, it's a bad outcome for both of them. And however, Blanchot says that almost impatience is necessary for us to, we need to contend with that impatience if we are to, create literature. I think what he says is that there's impatience must be the core of profound patience. So, what is there when we're doing the task of creating art is something that threatens to destroy what we're creating.
Mm-hmm. The threat though is sort of that honing in on it and the limitation, the description, the belief that there isn't a paradox, that we somehow understand it though. The looking back, the I guess the desire to understand it completely and assume that we know it or even know what's going on in that process.
Yeah, well, yes, I think that's what it is. And I think also, this is connected to a point that he makes elsewhere, which is that once the writer is done with the work, and you could even say this about recording albums or making a painting, once the writer is done and kind of like releases it or births the work, then he can sort of no longer, it becomes foreign, it becomes foreign to the writer in a certain way. And I think it has to do with this almost necessary forgetting of what was happening when the work was created.
But I don't think that's entirely psychological for Blanchot. I don't think it's simply the common case with writers where they might state something like, they're in a different place or with a different group of friends or even with a family and they're not with a family at a certain point in their life. This isn't biographically contextual or psychological. That place or non-place that someone's within at the time, or even duration that someone's within, isn't to do with those kind of things. Those things themselves would be a clear limitation as to understanding the paradox itself.
Yes, and this is now you're making me think. This is a good point, because just as this paradox is something beyond the psychological, I think it's both like more fundamental, but also just simply the psychological is only one thin layer really of what the writer's life is about. So whether that's the psychological or the concrete, there's some other impossible task that is, solitary and in excess of what is simply psychological. So just as much as that's the case, I think also literature itself for Blanchot, and there's another essay that we should talk about here as well, but literature itself is not about plots or characters or something. There's some other murmuring. He uses this, the term like language speaking or language ceaselessly kind of murmuring at us or something, and that's what literature is. So whether you're reading something like Beckett where it's literally murmuring, or if you're reading someone like Flaubert who has this whole constructed, more realistic idea of plots and characters, in each case there's something at stake which is not psychological or not realistic. So I think that's like doubled in the work of art itself for Blanchot.
And to the extent that something is just realistic, that is just this imitation, I mean, that for me personally is where writing loses me. There's a, I think it's a great book on writing for beginners, to be honest, in a very practical sense. But actually, Stephen King's On Writing is this great little introductory thing for this sort of practical layer of writing. But he would explain things like, don't get caught up don't get caught up too early in how to explain, how a character gets into a room, Billy walked into the room. But to the extent that writing is doing that, that's where it loses me, because I don't need to know that, because that's what we do know. So that's where you're almost abusing what writing can do by simply using it as a purely imitative device, almost like a hyper-realist painting. Is you're almost caught in this bind of why is this needed at all? But of course there is. For Blanchot, it seems that the extent that writing is, in a sense, useful, the only usefulness of Blanchot's writing is almost transitions between different states where it's no longer useful and it's doing something more. But that was all very abstract. But there you go.
No, I agree with you. I think there's this tendency or danger of writing almost trying to like short circuit itself, right? Like that simplicity. The simplicity is the hurdle, I guess, for forgetting what literature is about in the first place. It's not just about. I mean, some people will say it's about telling stories, but I think that Blanchot doesn't really think that. It's about and maybe Kevin said this in his episode, or maybe I'm drawing this from somewhere else, but it's about a certain phenomenology of literature, which is also a phenomenology of experience. Certainly not as rigorous or direct as one like Husserl's, but it is about describing almost non-discursively through language this kind of state, right? Which again, this is all a paradox, and this is what Blanchot gets at, and what I think is also necessary. The necessity of rereading him is to get at this state, and so there is a circularity and in his writing and in this kind of thinking.
There's a deep irony there that Husserl's own, what we might even try call a style, is quite literally almost the inverse of Blanchot, in the sense of trying to be so absolutely precise and limited on things as to not allow the reader any leeway as to appropriation. Be interesting to see an essay between, like, comparing the two in a way. I mean, even though they're doing different things, maybe they are actually doing somewhat of the same thing. But there is, I mentioned it at the start, I do really want to bring it in, because I mentioned it before we started recording, because I do think it will help us. I don't know if, have you read the Kekule problem?
I have.
Cormac McCarthy's one single paper, and it's a very simple thesis or idea, in that for him, he's looking at the history, to give the example, looking at the history of scientists and mathematicians and breakthroughs, and why it is that when there are all these different accounts of major scientific breakthroughs, that it isn't done in the realm of reason or rationality. They go to sleep, they have a dream, they wake up, and they write something down that's given to them as a symbol. Or they're in some sort of flow state and something comes to them as a symbol, or something just appears. And his argument is that this sort of subconscious layer, he doesn't really go towards the Freudian unconscious, in my opinion. I wouldn't say he does. He just sort of a bit more abstract than that, calls it the unconscious. Is that this symbolic layer of language is far, far older than the language that me and you are speaking right now. And so the Kekule problem, is the problem of why, when these things happen, are they given to us in this cryptic sense? Why does our brain, or what we might consider this brain, how this whole thing works, to say that is ridiculous. Why does it give us all of this data in a very cryptic sense and not simply say to us in language, here's the answer to your problem? The theory would be is because language is extremely new and that whole apparatus hasn't caught up. But the point being is, like, as McCarthy would say, is like, as I'm speaking to you right now and as you're speaking to me, I don't know what words I'm going to say, and yet somehow it all makes sense. Yeah. I don't know what I'm about to say to you, even though I kind of did know, because there has to be something there which is saying it. But in the sense that I try become conscious or limit it, I think is sort of the same paradox that Blanchot is entering into, as to what extent can things, ultimately, what role is this weird vessel that I'm embodying, playing in this weird act of creation where something just suddenly appears? I've just written some words down and I couldn't actually tell you what I was going to write before I wrote them. Unless it's editing, of course, in which case you sit there and you do the annoying thing of bringing up a dictionary, which is already feels very wrong. But I wanted to bring that in because I think Blanchot is dealing with, in a different way, he's dealing with this act of creation of like, what is our role? What role does the writer play in this sort of flow that's coming from somewhere which I think he does explicitly deal with, this weird outside space, the space where poetry comes from.
Right. I mean, I think, yeah, a lot of things come to mind, but I mean, I think that it's worth sort of grasping on a little bit to this question of the unconscious or of psychoanalysis. And there has been, people have written about this. Joseph Kuzma has a book on Blanchot and psychoanalysis, which is worth reading for sure. It has a more rigorous, kind of engagement with Blanchot's own encounters with psychoanalysis, but also ultimately makes the point that he was pursuing, if it is anything psychoanalytical, it's a psychoanalysis beyond psychoanalysis. Just like he'll say elsewhere that he was interested in a communism without communism or something, right? There's this always contestation of limits of discourse or limits of even positions, right? Like the limits of a certain position are always made very clear. So I think with Blanchot and this idea of the psychological or the psychoanalytic, it's only one dimension of the question. And what this outside would be, I think maybe one way to say it is that whatever this outside would be, or whatever this reason is, that maybe it is just in a dream, or, maybe it is only in some kind of nonsense that we come to an insight, is not unlike, in a certain way, the way that Deleuze talks about thought as something that's prompted by these almost arbitrary and accidental encounters just with the world itself. So sense and the meaning that we have to make out of the world is at its core is nonsense or something, right? Or at its core, there's something just simply maybe material or even immaterial that prompts something in us that maybe becomes a work of art, or maybe it becomes even a more logical or even more rational insight. But no, I am interested in this question specifically in terms of science, because I haven't really thought of.
There's something else just to bring in. I mean, we're going all over the map here, but I think it's key because, well, it's key and contemporary. This current debate around AI and limitation, and in relation to creativity, which I think is a very Blanchotian analysis, though no one's really admitted to it yet, in the sense that people critique AI because they say, well, all it can really do in its creative process is take 20,000 images as an input, but it's only got that limitation of the 20,000 as an output, which is very sort of anti-Blanchotian in a way. But I would say, well, okay, but most human beings are doing that because to the extent that a human being or whatever the apparatus is or whatever it is that can actually move outside of that notion of purely imitation into something more, that is not us. And I think maybe Blanchot would admit to this, right? Pretty much any human being can imitate. Here's 20,000 pictures of a tree, go paint a tree. But it takes something that we can't see for all these strange creative breakthroughs where, I don't know, they suddenly paint the tree as a black cube, right? That hasn't been a conscious decision. That's been Deleuze. You mentioned Deleuze. Deleuze would call it a caesura, right? This like splitting of the spiral, which suddenly, but he would say, well, look, this event of the caesura, we don't really know what it is. We don't know where it comes from, but it continues things on, and then we sort of enter into that next phase. Everyone goes, oh, now we've got that like almost unconscious tool to play around with, but you can't consciously bring the genius in. You can't consciously bring the outside in.
Right. I mean, this is why the genius also, you mentioned especially that term, the genius. I mean, we were just talking about Schopenhauer. I mean, I think the genius is a problem for all of these, even philosophers. For Kant, genius is what gives the rule to art, but it's not a rule, right? Like there can't be a rule to art. And also if art is too academic, then we don't like it. So, and for Schopenhauer, the genius, at least in my reading, is one for whom this kind of experience is a question, but that also has its own dangers because the genius especially when the stakes for Schopenhauer is that, beauty is some kind of break from the suffering that we have in the world. Then if you're the one who loves beauty, then that's, it is a life and death question. And at the same time, it is paradoxical and it can't be explained or reduced to some kind of schematism. So, yeah, I mean, I think partly, part of this paradox that interests clearly me and Blanchot and Deleuze is that, again, to touch back on Deleuze, it's the accidental nature of these moments that makes them so forceful. If we could just do art, and I mean, here's another interesting paradox too. We both love The Recognitions by William Gaddis, and thinking about somebody who is able to be an artist at the same time as forging paintings. How can you do that as an artist? How can you have moments of that experience when you're in principle copying somebody else's work to the smallest detail? And yet I think that's sort of what we're getting from the book, right? Like there's this scene where he refuses to paint a certain painting because he knew that the painter was sobbing as he was painting it. So he says, I can't do that. I can't. I don't know. Maybe that's a different dimension of this question, but I think it's so it shows, right, that it's not simply psychological and it's not simply realistic. It's something that's exceeds us in this way. We have to be pulled out of ourselves to create in this way.
Yeah, we have to be pulled out of ourselves. But I think actually what you focused on there is his from Gaddis, and we're sort of tiptoeing around Blanchot, but perhaps the only that. I don't mean to sound pretentious, but I wonder if that's the only way you can talk about him is by you don't want to, because there's no pool that you can dive into, like where there's not suddenly going to be some moment we go, right, let's talk about the exact Blanchotian thing now. But you mentioned the recognitions and the notion of not being able to forge a certain painting because the painter was crying. That's a temporal distinction. Like it's almost something that's since gone. Like all the paradox which was in that moment, which culminated in that event, has since left. And even if you were to zoom into the microscopic level and paint it one to one, it isn't once again a Deleuzian thing. There is still a difference on a completely another level. And actually, just to bring in something absolutely cheap, to move away from all this French pretentiousness. I'm kidding. But actually, I'm reminded of is it Back to the Future Part 2, where they go back to the future and he, the famous scene where he does the Johnny Be Good riff, and then at the end he says, "You're not ready for that yet." And perhaps that's why we can't approach, because it's almost like he's ripped something from the future and put the paradox into a time where no one has the means to deal with it because we're like 3 Kaisuras ahead.
Right.
And I wonder if something about Blanchot, which makes it extremely difficult to approach, is that he's not placing himself within a certain break in time or a certain moment of genius. He is trying to talk about what that is as he's engaging with it, whilst self-referentially telling you, look how limited, look how much of a struggle it is to do this. And Absolutely. You're caught in that. And that's why it's almost like always ahead of itself. And to the point where we could say, I understand Blanchot. We're no longer ahead of ourselves. So the whole thing would be a failure. If we ever understand Blanchot, then he's failed, is what I'd say.
I in my own experience, I think, approaching understanding maybe like 1 or 2 essays out of the hundreds that he wrote is something, because he does have this strange way of writing. But I mean, what you're making me think is that, or one thing to remember is, he did write. I mean, he wrote so many essentially book reviews, like a lot of his writings are basically or essays for a literature column, right, in a publication. So he wasn't sure, he has books, right? And I think maybe we can talk about this question of the book because he certainly was concerned quite a bit with Mallarmé and Mallarmé's idea of having this like this unbound, literally unbound book that could
Mm,
be in order. But so this means in principle that his writings on literature were occasional, and this
mm,
is something that maybe is more people think more of Derrida, but I mean it is blunt, and they were friends, and obviously Derrida took a lot of had a lot of insight from Blanchot, but I think this idea of investigating something in an occasional way
mm,
or occasioned by something also does show this on the one hand shows that it is being prompted by something in the world, even if that thing is literature. So every time that he's returning to literature with a different author, whether he's writing about Flaubert or Balzac or Mallarmé or Rilke, he is looking at the same question really, but it's an occasional view of this question. It's almost prismatic. So he has these same sort of maybe coordinates in mind, but they shift every time he returns to it.
mm.
And I think, so in a way there can be no definitive Blanchot text or definitive thing he says about literature or about art. The closest you can get to that is paradox, or the
Mm.
closest you can get to that is impossibility, because that really, I think, is what he was concerned with on a larger scale. But
But this doesn't seem futile for him. It would seem, from
oh,
afar, it seems like a futile gesture to try and write about paradox whilst being in that, but whilst acknowledging that you're within that paradox itself. Why do you think he doesn't see that as a futile gesture to put pen to paper?
I mean, there is, I guess, the easy answer that it like resists some gesture of totality, right?
Mm,
But I think, to put it in a more positive way, I think it remains sensitive to the experience of literature itself. I think that, which for him is a very, and I think I said this in the Deleuze episode when I was introducing my Hermitix room. He's concerned with life. He is concerned with what it is to be alive and how do we describe this feeling? Well, it's not I'm happy or I'm sad. It's actually it engages what he calls this kind of like ceaseless uh, and not play in like some deconstructive sense, but literally a ceaseless performance of language or a ceaseless kind of murmuring that can't really be stopped. I mean, I guess that's one place to maybe mention Beckett as well, because I think Beckett was after a similar question.
mm,
So yeah, it's not futile, because how else do we make art? We constantly return. And why do we listen to music, or why do we read things? We always return, especially rereading, re-listening. It's a return to something, and um, it engages a certain experience that I think is like very necessary to keep
mm.
in touch with.
It's interesting that when I was looking into the gaze of Orpheus, another famous person who's appropriated it sort of within this sphere is Jacques Lacan, and it seems that actually there would be a sort of impasse between the two thinkers, because this isn't language is possibly a means, whereas I think for Lacan it would certainly be anything beyond it shouldn't be said, and language is quite totalizing. I think for Lacan, in the self appears really in language and then retreats when it's not speaking. Whereas I think that there is more going on there for Blanchot, and language is, as you said, with life. Living is not simply being unhappy and happy, which is what made me think about this, because those two descriptions of what it is to be are not being in itself, which is what Blanchot is heading more towards. Life as in living, as in ontology, not life as in some sort of existential Thomas Hardy. I don't know. I sat on the bench and I was miserable. Blah blah blah. The being of that situation itself in relation to how that can even be described, and once again a further paradox. But nothing totalizing such as unhappiness and we see this in Thomas the Obscure, of course. Like Thomas the Obscure being Blanchot's, I think I'm right in saying his first literary sort of major literary piece of writing, I think. And
I believe
it
so.
begins really. It seems to me it begins in the sense that the what we could call the protagonist, um, caught in the sea and almost drowning and being thrashed about. It's like the first thing that happens in the first of all Blanchot texts is almost the quintessential death of the self. It's like, let's get that out of the way. Then then we can begin. That was something that should be happening at the end of novels, right? The end of Moby Dick. Everyone
Yeah.
gets thrown into like the abyss of truth, and this is like, right, okay, what happens after that? Blanchot starts at some weird end.
Right. I mean, I think the very possibility of asking what happens in a Blanchot text is, I mean, but you're right to pinpoint this because I've been rereading lately the his not a novel, I suppose, but his story, I guess, the one who was standing apart from me,
Hmm.
and quite literally nothing happens in it. It is a very strange text to read and to describe, and also funny in some parts. I think I sort of mentioned that to you. Like there is a kind of absurdity that comes about because in terms of what's actually being said on the page, it's this constant uh, question of being able to write and being able to speak. And at a certain point, the way that this is expressed is so stubborn and so repetitive that it's almost like seeing somebody have a crisis about writing. And when you read it in this way, it's almost laughable. It's like, are you writing right now? It keeps asking this question, but are you writing? But are you writing? And there's never really any response either way. So any possibility of action is sort of lost. But I think that so on the one hand, while I think that like Blanchot writes in a way that's, certainly you can say he was, if we're looking at any literary forebears, right, he's maybe inspired by Kafka and Beckett and some of these other writers who
Mhm.
have this very singular style. I think what he points out in his critical writing as well is that even like we were sort of already touching on, even when you have a text where there is this more legible plot or characters, that's still, for Blanchot, the way he's looking at it, that's still only one dimension of what
Hmm.
literature is. So you can say, I mean, so he has um, in his essay, The Narrative Voice, which is in The Infinite Conversation, it's a 10-page essay, and I return to it every once in a while, just like this kind of circular. Every once in a while, I need to reread this essay to try to have some new thought about it. And he, I would say, I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in Blanchot because I think what it does is that it seems to set up this hierarchy and then also like takes that hierarchy down in a really interesting way that once you set it up and then take it away, you begin to see where he's coming from with literature. And what I mean by hierarchy is uh, he talks about the type of literature which is like Flaubert, which you have the author who almost tries to remain distant from the characters and sort of allows the characters to play out their lives, and the author is simply describing and doesn't want to intervene, right? So he
Hmm.
says this is the classical idea of aesthetic disinterest, where we need to be viewing from afar almost as if it's like a play on a stage, and we don't have any contact, but we're simply like almost just receiving the text. And then he contrasts this with Kafka. He says in Kafka, something else happens. He says that there's a strange element that begins to infect the text that doesn't allow us any distance anymore. In what he calls that is the neutral or the narrative voice. He says that we hear this speaking in literature, and we oftentimes hear it as madness. So I think there's an interesting dimension there too. We might mistake this strange voice as madness. I mean, you've been reading Thomas Bernhard. Maybe there's something there too, right? There's this. Maybe it's not only madness, maybe it's bitterness or something. But there is language when, especially when it's repetitive in this way. So Beckett too. What it's driving at is something. I think something beyond language, but I do
Hmm.
also think. I think that it. So while this seems like a hierarchy, like, oh, Flaubert is now the naive, we don't need that anymore. That's this one kind of literature. And actually, what I'm interested in is Kafka and all these weird writers who allow the text to speak in this way. I mean, I think Blanchot's ultimate point is that those writers are exemplary for showing us that this is true of all literature. So you go back to Flaubert and you can read Flaubert and see language itself speaking still, even though there's a plot and there are characters and there is this attempt by the author to have this kind of distanced thing. So language itself does this, and I mean, so beyond the intentions of the authors. So maybe some authors are more consciously trying to do this, and I think that Blanchot certainly did that with his own, because he does write, he has texts that read like Kafka or Beckett, or, he does have these texts where it's difficult to see what's going on, where it's hard to imagine any of these characters as people, or it's hard to, you can't visualize it, but it is. But I think his point was actually, and where he can be really instructive for anybody who likes any kind of literature, is that this is always happening. And when we realize that, we unlock this experience of literature that maybe wasn't possible before.
Well, it's I mean, what you said about not being able to visualize, I mean, that I think is actually key. I mean, there is this there's that sort of famous test that people can do, and though I don't think it's entirely limited to this level, the test of visualizing a red apple, and what level of sort of can you hold the some image of bright red apple in your mind? How long can you hold it? What does it look like? And there's sort of these 5 levels. And for me, I really struggle with these. For me, things appear in my mind very much as ideas. Like, I know what an apple is, but there isn't a red apple in my mind. It's not 1-to-1 or something like that. And the reason I would mention this is because perhaps it is a very clear distinction between certain types of readers, in that a lot of genre fiction, fantasy and sci-fi, I find extremely boring. Possibly because I've never really thought about this until now, but possibly because I can't think of a great big spaceship in my mind flying past the moon. It doesn't interest me because it's not there. It's not this sort of cool thing happening in my mind. Those are just ideas to me. And so to that extent, it's almost like reading a car manual, because it's like this and this and this and this happened. Okay, well, you're just explaining causation to me. What's the point? It's almost an abuse of language, in the sense you've limited it to such a degree that you've brought it right back round to the real world. So why did we undertake this at all? Whereas with Blanchot, he's utilizing language in the sense that, well, there is no visualization. You're entering into that almost the non-Apple idea of whatever they might be, ideas that lead you somewhere more.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think like, so maybe part of it. So I think it is also certainly part of certain readers, because I think I have the same issue of, I mean, it's also maybe a different way of saying, the ability to visualize something or not. But for me to think, oftentimes I have to just talk to myself. So for me, a lot of times articulating an idea, I can't just sit down and think and have this idea. I mean, sometimes I have to pace around and try to like actually allow the idea to come out through speech. And I wonder if there's some connection there where with literature that's fantastical or epic or something like that, although I think Blanchot's point, which I was just mentioning, is that literature still does have this strange type of neutrality to it. It is harder, I guess, at first glance to see what we can do with it as a reader, right? Or not see what we can do with it, but when there's no fracture in it, or when there's no negative space, or when there's no room, I guess, for us to almost work with it. And I don't mean write about it. I mean
almost the question of, what did you want? Right? Like, what do you want from a book?
Yeah,
you pick up certain books, and it's sort of transparent that you want to just go be entertained. You want to have a bit of fun. You want heroes and villains, but why do I guess Blanchotian literature questions all of your presumptions of why you read at all, and what was it you wanted from this? And I think of sort of like a writer, like one of my absolute favorites, Daniel Kalms, who would often, he would finish stories because he'd just write, I can't be bothered to finish this, and completely usurp all presumptions of the reader and just say, and then, or like he'd get so bored with the story and make it clear, he'd say, and then they all fell out the window and died because he just couldn't be bothered to finish it. And I think Blanchot is doing exactly the same thing with this sort of negation of presumptions regarding what language is meant to be. You know, this isn't right. This isn't this. You haven't given me anything. But in the sense that you haven't been given anything, then I don't know. There's somewhere to work. There's something to work with. But I think we're both, like I did with Kevin Hart, struggling to define it, because once it's defined, it's gone. Once it's defined, It's not gone. It's uninteresting because it's imitation once again.
Well, because it's the motion of literature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think with Blanchot, there's this kind of, it has to be interactive is not the right word. That's certainly not what I mean, and I don't mean literally doing something with it again, like not like writing about it or not performing it, but when we read, we are doing something, and when it, you know. And I don't think that he would say that there's some hierarchy, you know, between science fiction or whatever, you know, or epic tales and more abstract things. But I do think that those maybe more difficult, or what in one instance would seem to make us expend a lot more effort. So something like Beckett, right? Like we need to read this, and it takes all this effort from us, right? It takes all this. We need to. It's difficult, right? Something that's difficult. At the same time as it seems to require this effort, it puts us in a passive position where we're not able to eagerly meet the text in the way that we're forced to engage with it. You know, we're not just sitting down happily to receive our tale of, you know, spaceships and things like that. We're actually, but we can't put it down. I mean, this is the experience I have reading Blanchot. I don't always know what's happening or why I'm reading it, but I certainly can't stop reading it. You know, there's this kind of, he I guess allows something to speak that we don't, you know, normally hear in literature. And this again is something that is always there in literature. It's just we don't think about it that way.
There's a quote that I had jotted down. Each piece of music presents us with the organ we need to receive it. And once again, entering into that paradox, much like Orpheus looking back, the development of that organ is a passive organ. Something else is almost doing the work for you, and you look back and you go, I wonder what that thing actually is. Well done. You've ruined the process. There's almost like an atheistic faith, and I say atheistic because, you know, Blanchot would not allow the God type faith, but there's like a faith in an allowance of whatever this thing will be,
right?
To appear. To do what it needs to do. And I think I've just, speaking personally, I've often found that really what makes the writing which I've been happier with is actually less of my, like very strangely, allowing less of myself to get involved. Because sometimes there is a sentence in your mind and it's almost too honest or too clear or something, and you think, no, I need to tweak that a bit. And it's sort of a strange noumenal honesty which just needs to be allowed. People are often told to write what they know, but then people interject into that and ruin it. Right.
I mean, speaking about the quote about the organ, you know, the organ to receive, that organ, we you know, speaking already about occasional writing, that organ is an occasional organ as well. You know, if it's created by the thing that we're engaging with in that very moment, then that organ simply comes into being spontaneously, as it were, in that same moment. And I wonder, I mean, there's a certain, I think, I mean, this is I guess a different question, but I always wonder about, because Nietzsche, you know, famously critiqued Kant in Kant's idea of disinterestedness. He says that Kant allows the spectator, or he introduces the spectator into the question of the beautiful. And for Nietzsche, this is a bad thing. Like And then he quickly then says, what about, he mentions artists, what about the experience of the artist? He's concerned with this, and he thinks that the experience of what he calls the spectator can never rival that of the artist, because for the artist, there's this life or death question of needing to create the work, and being invested, precisely interested in the work, right? Like, we can't be disinterested in something, if we understand disinterest in that way, if it's a life or death situation. Like, the artist needs to create, and that for Nietzsche is like kind of, this is the basis on which he's able to critique Kant. But I mean, I wonder, and this is I guess a larger question that I'm preoccupied with, is there a disinterest? Can there be a life or death disinterest? Or, for Blanchot, maybe this would be like some kind of neutral state of creation, or maybe this is what the narrative voice, or what's at play in language, kind of points us to, where at bottom it doesn't matter if we're reading Flaubert or Kafka. We still are so interested to the point where we can't not be interested, and yet that seems to mirror the spontaneity of what would be Kantian disinterest, because we can't simply will ourselves to be disinterested. Do you know what I mean? Maybe something,
For me, this just draws to this distinction between useful literature and those who have nothing to say, and the sort of a very deep irony that, in the sense that a writer has something to say and it's useful, somewhere along the line, in some space that we can't really name, they've already said it. It's already done. Why are we bothering? It's like, once again, back to sort of like almost like a manual for a car. Okay, well, you've said it. Even if, I think I would even go so far to say, even if in your own mind it's done, that the thing has been said somewhere in space. But when you don't have anything to say, I mean, this is the whole Beckettian approach, right?
Right.
Why? What happens when you write and have nothing to say? And there's something extremely, it leads you somewhere which isn't imitation. It's not of your own. It's a different type of duration. I think it leads you straight into the heart of paradox, and paradox is going to work you out, not the other way, I guess.
Well, and also, I mean, importantly, that Beckettian thing, and I think also what Blanchot was interested in, is so singular to precisely the one who is doing it. So even if it is this touching on the outside, it's still, we read Beckett and it's unmistakably Beckett. Like, it unmistakably makes an instrument of him to give voice to this, even if what his task is not to say something, but just to say, or to allow to be said, to like clear the space for this again, murmuring of language, I think, is probably the best way to put it. But it's still so identifiably Beckett. And I think this is maybe like part of the paradox. And I wonder if there's I guess maybe my question that I'm trying to articulate is if there's some relation between that on the writer's side and this organ in us on the, the spectator or whoever. This is why I brought up Nietzsche. Is there something like that that gets engaged when we have this experience of literature? Is there some necessity of, I mean, there are many reasons or many ways to answer the question of why we would read, but is there something akin to whether or not we're creative in other aspects in our lives? Is there something akin to the creative drive there that has the sort of stakes, that might be there for the artist who can't be disinterested in the normal, way?
Well, I think about this a lot, to be honest, especially at the moment when we're reading a lot of Bernhard. The question of, why do I wish to spend my spare time reading something which is only really bolstering my misery? Why does that interest me so much? Why don't I go read something happy and cheer myself up? And it's nothing to do with those emotions. Once again, it's I would go so far as to say it's ontological. It's an ontological agreement of someone working out the same paradox you found yourself within, I think. And anything which isn't that is tyrannical. It's an absolute travesty. I think it's almost like if you step into someone else's paradox, someone else reading something which you don't, which if I read something which is optimistic, it would almost be like trying to duct tape someone else's organ, you know, onto me and try to process it in that way, and it's just going to fail. It's going to be an absolute failure because it's not a
Right.
paradox that I've ever recognized as a paradox. And yeah, I mean, there's something more, but that question does sort of plague me in a way of, oh, I've just ordered another miserable book. Why have I done this?
No, but I mean, it's see, even in your example, I think like it's precisely uh, you're saying it's not about those emotions, but you're choosing the example of the most like sour, like most miserable, monotonous, repetitive. And I think that I would do the same thing. So I think that there's something very true about this, where on the one hand, it's not even about what story is being told.
Mm,
It's about an intensification of this paradox, maybe again, maybe this is the way to sort of connect the reader and the writer in some way, right? Like the writer has to do something because for whatever reason they're not able to exist otherwise in the world, and I
mm.
think that sounds silly or whatever, but I think that is very true. I mean, if you think about what it is to do it, it's just a bunch of time spent alone, with no guarantee of anything, and yet all of these writers had this as if it were their like task or mission. But I wonder then, like, so in the contemporary moment where it's so kind of useless to read and pointless, and there's no, why do we continue to do it? It's not the same as making art, but it is. Uh, it's not for knowledge. We're not like learning anything,
Mm.
but we're indirectly, I guess, learning something about experience or
Well,
about
it's a
life.
strange distinction between nothing to say and usefulness, because once something's useful, there's a clear function, there's almost a functionality as to why someone is creating it. I mean, you think of a sort of a kitsch, crappy landscape painting. You could say, well, it's useful art because that's going to go up in some doctor's office and just be basically the equivalent of artistic filler, which should all be burnt and destroyed. But in the sense that you're sitting down when you have nothing to say, I mean, to go back to him, Cormac McCarthy has a quote from his early days that to write a novel you must be insane, and I think he is relating that to that notion of what in the world compels human beings to sit down and put themselves through this, enter into this horrible paradox, expend an absolute ton of energy, almost expend themselves over, and in the process cause a lot of misery and whatever sort of existential tumult, and sort of mess up the order for no payoff, almost negative payoff.
Yeah,
There's not, if you want to make money, you're not going to be a writer. You
right.
wouldn't make that decision. So
And without even the guarantee of escaping from that paradox too, I think
you're
is.
going, you're bolstering it.
I
I
mean,
think if you,
you're Orpheus going. I mean, we get back to Orpheus. This is exactly what Blanchot was
Mhm.
talking about. There's the possibility that you're going to be ripped apart at the end of it. I mean, and that intensifying the paradox maybe then is like this threat of looking back and maybe losing the thing that you're trying to work on in the first place.
Yeah,
So,
but you care. You almost don't make the decision that you
right.
do inherently care about it enough that something compels you. You have to do it. Because I've
Mhm.
thought about this. You sit down and I think, you know what, I could quite happily never write again. And it's not me that's really writing, it's something that's playing me. Because no sane person would bother to sit down and do all this. There's nothing functional or useful about it. And yet, something compels me to do it in the same sense that something compels me to eat.
Right.
Um, and in the sense that I don't do it, it's gonna nag and grow, almost like some sort of strange. I don't know.
Well, and
Um,
I think like it's also important because you could extend, and I do think that you can extend these same comments about any sort of art,
hmm,
but specifically with literature where what you're creating is made solely out of language.
Mm.
Yet, when you have the paradox of trying to touch on something in a way that isn't just, again, I'm happy, I'm sad. It's not mimetic. It's not even necessarily discursive at a certain point. What's being, I mean, just like Blanchot himself, I guess, what's being talked about is only being circled around. And whether that involves literal repetition or an indirectness of approach. I mean, reading The One Who Is Standing Apart from Me, I realized I was taking notes on it, and there's one out of the entire thing, there's one proper name, and it's Van Gogh. It mentions Van Gogh once. There's nothing else to tie it to the real world. There's there's me, there's writing, there's a window. He keeps mentioning a glass of water that he keeps. I mean, it's a very strange, almost like amnesia dream of a book, because he keeps. It's unclear if this, or I mean, it's not even a he. Again, I guess this is Blanchot's point, is that it's just literature or language itself is the one that's saying I. But it's unclear even what we could call events in the book. The narrative voice is constantly saying, basically, that I don't know if that happened though. Was I dreaming if that happened, or did I actually go get a glass of water from the kitchen? I don't remember. I'm in a different room now, you know. And so like for the very material of the form of the work of art to be not only, you know, it's not stone, and it's not taking stone that we use to build, you know, buildings and turning it into a sculpture instead, something that's not useful, but it's the thing that we use to communicate to each other, and it's engaging it in this totally alien way, you know. Even if you are sitting down and writing a realistic novel or a realistic story, you're still doing something that's totally almost unbound from the world.
That's why I mentioned it being alien, and I think that's why for me I brought in McCarthy's paper, The Kekule Problem, because I think in the sense that I would actually almost go so far as to say that in the sense that the mind, what we were talking about earlier with the red apple thing, shapes and words, what's useful in the world is mostly shapes and things that slop together, and it's like, that's done. I can see it, sense data. But in the sense that there's language, when it becomes useful, is more alien, because language is always trying to convey a symbol or a feeling or an experience which is inherently not of it, because those experiences and feelings are not language. So language is always alien. And in the sense of what Blanchot is, I think, trying to do to an extent, and probably this is about as far as I could go in the sense of saying I understand Blanchot, or what it is allowing language to at least try return to the paradox of its own situation.
Yes. I think that is right though. It's funny, I have a quote exactly in mind that maybe ties some of this up, or maybe just intensifies the paradox a little bit more. I'm not sure, but he writes in another really excellent essay that if anybody wants to figure out in general what Blanchot thinks about literature, this is a good place to start. It's called Literature and the Right to Death. He says, literature is that experience through which the consciousness discovers its being in its inability to lose consciousness, in the movement whereby, as it disappears, as it tears itself away from the meticulousness of an I, it is recreated beyond unconsciousness as an impersonal spontaneity, the desperate eagerness of a haggard knowledge which knows nothing, which no one knows, and which ignorance always discovers behind itself as its own shadow changed into a gaze. So quite a dense quotation, but I do think this is, I mean, I think, you know, we keep using the term paradox, but I also think that there is it is hard, especially if you have a hard time having images in your head, but there is a way in which, for Blanchot, I think experience and literature and life are almost these mirrors of each other, or you pass through the paradox, and maybe you don't resolve the paradox, but you're sort of on the other side of it always. And I think that this question of of exhaustion, of as he says, a haggard knowledge which knows nothing. All we're doing with literature is just moving on to the other side of this paradox and trying to see it from the other side, maybe. Because in this essay too, it's a fascinating essay because he basically uses Hegel to talk about literature, but instead of Hegel's aesthetics, he's using the phenomenology. So he's talking about how literature kind of has this absolute ability to do anything, but it's also cut off totally from the world. So it has this uselessness to it. So it can do anything, but it's useless. And yet, like for the writer, these are high stakes endeavors. So I think this is what he's always wondering about.
Is there anything you'd like to add about Blanchot's literature?
I don't think so. I think we went all over the place, but I think we kind of touched on some of the real problems, I guess.
Well, the whole thing's a problem. It's good, but it's a good problem. But I think, literature and the right to death and the gaze of Orpheus, theoretically speaking, are two good entry points. And then I would probably still agree with Kevin Hart in terms of, like, if you want just a quick sort of, I think about 35 pages, but the madness of the day in terms of the actual literature is just such a great entry. And it's unlike anything else I've ever read. But we have this periodical from First to Knock Publishers, which is free. You need to sign up before June 16th. When this video goes live, you'll probably have about 3 weeks.
Okay, yeah. I believe that's the date that Michael gave me. So just go to the First to Knock website and send an email. Everyone should do it. I mean, he's doing a great press, and even the periodicals are beautiful. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it turns out.
Well, all those links will be in the description below. But Bryan Counter, once again, it's been a great discussion. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.